The sterile air of the hospital corridor felt heavy in Clara's lungs as she trudged toward the exit, the ghost of a 16-hour double shift clinging to her like a shroud. Each squeak of her worn sneakers on the polished floor was a countdown to freedom, a rhythmic beat marking the final steps of her workday. The late afternoon sun slanted through the large windows, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for her. Her body ached with a profound weariness that went bone deep, her mind a fog of medical charts, beeping monitors, and hushed, anxious conversations. All she wanted was the familiar comfort of her car, the quiet drive home, and the warm embrace of her daughter, who'd been waiting for her all day. She was a single mother running on empty, and home was the only filling station she had. It was in that hazy state between duty and escape that a small voice, fragile as spun glass, pierced through her exhaustion. "Excuse me?" He stood before her, a boy no older than 7, his pale skin almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights. A standard-issue hospital gown hung loosely on his frail frame, and his dark, solemn eyes held a depth of sorrow that seemed far too immense for his small face. He was clutching a small, dark wooden box, holding it out to her with both hands as if it were a precious, fragile treasure. The box was clearly old, its edges worn smooth with time, and a tiny, rusted lock held it shut. "My dad left this for me," the boy whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and hope. "He said I should only open it when I really needed to. I think I need to now." Clara's immediate instinct was to refuse, to gently redirect him to the nurse's station and continue her march toward the parking garage. Every muscle in her body protested the thought of any further delay. Her shift was over. Her own child was waiting. The gnawing guilt of another long day spent away from her was a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth, but she stopped, her feet suddenly feeling as though they were bolted to the floor. It was the raw vulnerability in the boy's gaze, a profound loneliness she recognized from the loneliest hours of her own life after her husband's passing. She saw not just a patient, but a kindred spirit adrift in a sea of loss, clinging to the last remnant of a loved one. The weariness in her bones was no match for the sudden, sharp pang of empathy that seized her heart. A quiet sigh escaped her lips, a small surrender to the unexpected pull of this moment. She knelt down, the fabric of her scrubs rustling as she brought herself to his eye level, closing the space between the world-weary nurse and the grief-stricken child. "I think I can help with that," she said, her voice softer and warmer than she'd felt all day. When she took the box, its cool, smooth wood felt solid and real in her tired hands. The bustling hospital corridor seemed to fade into a muted, distant hum. The urgency to leave evaporated, replaced by a quiet curiosity. It was just her and the boy, suspended in a bubble of shared purpose. She examined the tiny, tarnished lock, her fingers, so accustomed to the precise and delicate work of her profession, now carefully probing the old, stubborn mechanism. After a moment of fumbling, she used the thin edge of her staff ID card, sliding it into the keyhole and wiggling it gently. A faint but decisive click echoed in the stillness. The small latch sprang open, and the lid lifted with a soft, wooden creak that sounded like a sigh from the past. The boy leaned in closer, his breath held in a silent, hopeful prayer. Clara peered inside, her mind bracing for a simple childhood keepsake, a collection of marbles, a folded, hand-drawn map, or a lucky coin. But what lay nestled on the faded velvet lining made her own breath catch in her throat. It wasn't a toy, it was a photograph. And as her eyes focused on the smiling faces in the old, faded image, a dizzying, impossible wave of recognition crashed over her. She did not know it yet, but this simple act of kindness had just unlocked a door to a past she never knew existed. The world tilted on its axis, the polished hospital floor seeming to fall away beneath Clara's worn sneakers. Her exhaustion vanished, replaced by a jolt of adrenaline so potent it made her heart hammer against her ribs. It wasn't just a photograph, it was a ghost. Her husband, David, smiled back at her from the faded sepia tones, his arm slung casually around another soldier, a man whose face she'd never seen, but whose features were undeniably echoed in the small, hopeful boy standing before her. The sterile, impersonal corridor suddenly felt charged with an impossible energy, a nexus point where past and present had collided with breathtaking force. Her carefully constructed reality, built on the foundations of grief and survival, began to fracture. She looked from the smiling man in the photo to the pale child, and the resemblance was a physical blow, leaving her breathless and utterly disoriented. A fierce internal war erupted within her. One part of her, the pragmatic single mother, screamed to close the box, hand it back, and walk away. Her daughter was waiting. The babysitter would be calling any minute. Her life was a precarious balancing act, and this ghost from a forgotten war, this child with her husband's friend's eyes, was a complication she could not afford. It was not her responsibility. Her shift was over, but another voice, deeper and more insistent, refused to be silenced. It was the voice of the widow who still ached for one more piece of the man she had lost. It was the voice of the nurse who had sworn an oath to care for the vulnerable. Looking at Leo's trusting face, she knew that walking away would be a betrayal, not just of the boy, but of the memory of the man smiling in that photograph. Her professional composure returned, a familiar mask she wore to navigate the daily tragedies of her job. She knelt again, ensuring the box was held securely between them, a fragile bridge connecting their two separate worlds of loss. "What was your father's name?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, betraying none of the chaos churning inside her. Leo's face, which had been clouded with uncertainty, brightened with the simple act of being asked. "His name was Michael," he said, a proud little tremor in his voice. "He was a hero. He told me stories about his best friend in the army, David. He said David was the bravest man he ever knew and that he made a promise to him." Each word was a key, unlocking a room in Clara's heart she thought had been sealed forever. David had never spoken of a Michael, but the conviction in the boy's voice was absolute. The decision solidified, no longer a choice, but a necessity. She pulled her phone from her pocket, the screen lighting up with a missed call from the babysitter. With trembling fingers, she typed a quick message. "Something's come up. I'm going to be late. I'm so sorry." She didn't offer an explanation she couldn't possibly articulate. Hitting send felt like closing one door to open another, far more uncertain one. She then looked at Leo, offering a small, reassuring smile that felt both foreign and deeply familiar on her face. "Michael's son shouldn't be standing in a cold hallway," she said gently. "How about we go to the cafeteria? I'll buy you a hot chocolate, and you can tell me more about your dad." She reached out and took his small, cool hand in hers, a silent pact of solidarity against the overwhelming mystery before them. As they began their slow walk down the corridor, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the air. "Clara?" It was Mrs. Davison, the head nurse, a woman whose adherence to protocol was legendary. Her gaze was stern, sweeping from Clara's tired face to the small boy in the patient gown holding her hand. "Your shift ended nearly an hour ago. You know the children from the oncology ward have a strict visitation and movement schedule." The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air. Clara was breaking the rules, neglecting her duties and risking her job. The immediate cost of her choice had just materialized in the formidable shape of her superior, and Clara knew, with a sinking feeling, that this simple act of compassion was about to become far more complicated. Ignoring Mrs. Davison's stern, disapproving gaze, Clara felt a surge of protective instinct that solidified her resolve. She straightened her back, her tired posture gaining a sudden, quiet strength. While her mind raced with the professional consequences of her insubordination, her heart was anchored to the small, trusting hand she held in hers. "With all due respect, Mrs. Davison," Clara began, her voice even and calm, "this is a personal matter. Leo is not feeling well, and I believe a warm drink in the cafeteria is precisely the care he needs at this moment. I will take full responsibility for him and ensure he is returned to his ward promptly." She didn't offer any more details, creating a boundary of privacy around herself and the boy. The head nurse's eyes narrowed, but seeing the unyielding compassion in Clara's expression, she gave a curt, reluctant nod. "See that you do," she said, before turning and walking away, her sharp footsteps echoing down the now empty corridor. The walk to the cafeteria was a journey from one world to another. They left behind the sterile silence and the scent of antiseptic and entered a space filled with the low, comforting hum of life. The air here was warm, thick with the smells of brewed coffee, chicken soup, and freshly baked bread. Muted conversations and the gentle clatter of cutlery provided a soothing soundtrack. Leo's small hand, which had felt so cold and fragile in the hallway, seemed to absorb some of the warmth from hers. He looked around with wide, curious eyes, his frail shoulders relaxing slightly as they moved away from the clinical environment of the wards. For the first time since she met him, a flicker of simple childhood wonder replaced the heavy sorrow in his gaze. Clara guided him to a small, secluded booth in the corner, a quiet island where their fragile new connection could take root, away from prying eyes. Clara returned from the counter with a steaming mug of hot chocolate, topped with a generous cloud of whipped cream, and a simple black coffee for herself. She placed the mug carefully in front of Leo, whose eyes lit up with a genuine, unadulterated joy that felt like a ray of sunshine in the dim cafeteria. He wrapped his small hands around the ceramic, his fingers barely touching, and let out a soft sigh of contentment as the warmth seeped into his skin. My dad used to make this for me," he whispered, his voice thick with memory. "He said it was liquid courage for tough days." He then began to speak of his father, not as a tragic figure, but as a hero who told bedtime stories of friendship and bravery under desert stars. He spoke of David, a man Clara knew as her quiet, gentle husband, but who lived on in Leo's mind as a legendary, fearless soldier, thanks to the stories Michael had passed down. As Leo spoke, the pieces of a puzzle Clara never knew existed began to assemble themselves in her mind. His words were a child's fragmented recollections, yet they painted a vivid picture of a profound bond. "Dad said he made a promise to David," Leo explained, looking up from his mug, a smudge of chocolate on his upper lip. "He promised he would find you and your little girl, if anything happened. He said he looked for you for a very long time after he came home, but it was like you had disappeared." A wave of understanding washed over Clara. The post office had lost their mail for months after she moved in with her parents following David's death. The phone number had changed. She had been so consumed by her own grief, she had inadvertently become a ghost. Michael hadn't abandoned his promise. He had simply been unable to fulfill it. A comfortable silence settled between them as Leo focused on finishing his treat. Clara watched him, her heart a turbulent mix of sorrow for the lost years and a strange, burgeoning hope. This boy was not a reminder of what she had lost, but a living testament to a love and friendship that had endured beyond death itself. As he took his last sip, he looked at the wooden box, which sat on the table between them like a silent witness. "Dad also said the box would know who to trust," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper. "He told me there was another secret inside it. Not just the picture, he said it was the most important part of the promise." Clara's gaze fell upon the box. It seemed so ordinary, its wood worn and its latch simple, but now it held the weight of two families, of a sacred vow, and of a secret she was beginning to realize was meant for her all along. Clara's fingers traced the worn edges of the wooden box, her gaze fixed on the empty space where the photograph had been. The boy's words echoed in her mind, a soft but persistent drumbeat. Another secret inside, the most important part of the promise. She ran her thumb over the faded velvet lining, feeling the slight indentation left by the photograph over the years. Her nurse's hands, trained to detect the slightest abnormality in the human body, now searched for a hidden flaw in this simple object. A subtle unevenness near the back corner caught her attention. It was almost imperceptible, a slight rise in the fabric. With a surgeon's precision, she pressed down gently, feeling a faint give, and then carefully pried the edge of the lining up with her fingernail. It lifted easily, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment she had completely overlooked. Beneath the false bottom, nestled in the dark recess, lay a small bundle of letters. They were folded into tight, neat squares and bound together with a simple piece of twine that had grown brittle with age. The paper was thin, almost translucent, and the edges were soft and frayed from repeated handling. As she carefully lifted the bundle, the faint, dusty scent of old paper and forgotten memories rose to meet her. Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She didn't need to see the name on the envelopes. She knew the handwriting instantly. The elegant, slightly slanted script was as familiar to her as her own reflection. It was David's. A cold wave of confusion and disbelief washed over her. Why were her husband's letters she had never received, hidden in a box belonging to a man she had never met? Leo watched her, his large, dark eyes filled with a quiet curiosity. He seemed to understand that this was a moment for adults, a discovery that belonged to a world he was not yet a part of. Clara offered him a trembling, watery smile, trying to shield him from the storm of emotions brewing inside her. With unsteady hands, she worked the knot of the twine loose, its fibers crumbling under her touch. She unfolded the first letter, the crisp sound of the aging paper unnaturally loud in the quiet corner of the cafeteria. The words on the page were not just ink, they were a portal. They pulled her from the warm, coffee-scented air and plunged her into the dust and heat of a forgotten battlefield, into a moment of terror her husband had never found the words to tell her about in person. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before David was scheduled to come home. He wrote not of victory or bravery, but of fear. He described a sudden, violent ambush, the terrifying whistle of mortars, and the searing pain of shrapnel tearing through his leg. He wrote of lying in the dirt, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. Certain he would never see her or their unborn daughter again. Then he wrote of Michael. While others fell back under orders, Michael had refused to leave him behind. He had crawled through a hail of gunfire, thrown David over his shoulder, and carried him to the relative safety of a ravine. David's life was saved in that moment, but Michael had paid a steep price. A single piece of shrapnel had struck him in the back, an injury the field medics deemed minor at the time, but which David now knew was far more sinister. Clara's breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat as she read the final lines of the letter. The promise wasn't just a friendly pact, it was a life debt. David confessed his overwhelming guilt, knowing that his friend's quiet, persistent health problems, which had just begun to surface, were a direct result of that one heroic act. Michael had not only saved David's life, but he had also inadvertently traded his own long-term health for it. Clara looked across the table at Leo, this small, frail boy, and saw not just a patient, but the living legacy of an unimaginable sacrifice. The injustice of it all was a physical weight on her chest. Michael had spent years silently carrying the cost of his heroism, but what Clara couldn't possibly comprehend in that moment was that the true reason for his silence, and the most heartbreaking secret of all, was still hidden in the remaining letters. With trembling fingers, Clara unfolded the next letter, her eyes scanning the familiar script that seemed to carry her husband's voice across time. The tone of this letter was different, filled not with the immediate terror of battle, but with a quiet, profound awe. David wrote about Michael's mind, describing it as a brilliant, restless engine that was constantly designing and inventing, even in the dusty, chaotic environment of their forward operating base. He spoke of Michael's obsession with a new type of portable diagnostic tool, an idea sparked by the crude and ineffective equipment they had on the front lines. He detailed late-night conversations where Michael sketched complex diagrams in the dirt with a stick, dreaming of a future where technology could save lives with speed and precision, a future he wanted to build for soldiers like them. Her breath caught as she opened the final, thickest envelope. Tucked inside the letter was a more formal document, a single page filled with dense, legal-sounding text, but signed at the bottom with two familiar signatures. David's confident scrawl and Michael's sharper, more angular script. The letter explained it all. It was a rudimentary partnership agreement, a pact made on hope and a handshake, legally drafted by a fellow soldier who had been a lawyer in his civilian life. Michael had insisted on it. If his medical technology idea ever became a reality, if it ever led to a company, David would be his equal partner. It was non-negotiable, Michael had argued, because the very inspiration for the life-saving tech was born from the day he saved David's life. It was a debt he intended to repay, not with money, but with a shared future. Overwhelmed, Clara lowered the papers, her vision blurring. The bustling cafeteria seemed a universe away. It was all too much, a heroic sacrifice, a hidden illness, and now a ghost of a business partnership. She felt a small tug on her sleeve. It was Leo, his expression filled with a child's simple concern. He pointed a small, frail finger toward the far wall of the cafeteria, toward a large, gilded portrait she had passed thousands of times, but never truly seen. It depicted a handsome, sharp-eyed man in a dark suit, his expression one of quiet confidence and intelligence. "That's him," Leo whispered, his voice filled with a quiet pride that pierced through Clara's shock. "That's my dad." Clara's gaze followed his finger, and her world, which was already tilting, finally shattered. Her eyes locked onto the portrait, then drifted down to the gleaming brass plaque affixed to the wall beneath it. The engraved letters seemed to burn into her consciousness, each word a hammer blow against the foundations of her reality. Michael Anderson, founder and chief benefactor, Anderson Medical Technologies. The name of the hospital, the very institution where she worked tirelessly day after day just to make ends meet, was a wing funded by his philanthropy. She was a struggling nurse, drowning in debt and exhaustion, working in a building that existed because of the quiet genius of the man who had saved her husband and whose son now sat before her, clutching a mug of hot chocolate she had paid for with the last few dollars in her pocket. The crushing, cosmic irony of it all stole the air from her lungs. She stared at the document in her hand, the ink a testament to a promise that had silently woven their fates together for years. This wasn't just a story of a forgotten friendship. It was the story of a hidden legacy, a shared destiny that had been waiting in the dark for this exact moment to be brought into the light. The small, sick boy in the standard-issue hospital gown was not just a patient. He was the heir to a fortune built on a battlefield dream. And she, the grieving widow, the single mother, the exhausted nurse, was, through a promise made in the shadow of death, his father's partner. Her life was no longer her own. It was now part of a story far larger and more complicated than she could ever have imagined, and she had no idea what the next chapter held. The immediate, dizzying shock of the revelation began to curdle within Clara, hardening into a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. The comforting warmth of the cafeteria, the gentle hum of life that had felt like a sanctuary just moments before, now seemed to mock her. She looked from the gilded portrait of the powerful, confident benefactor to the small, frail boy sipping his hot chocolate. and the profound human connection she had felt evaporated, replaced by an impassable chasm of status and wealth. Her simple act of kindness, buying a grieving child a warm drink, now felt absurdly pathetic. A pittance offered to the son of the man who owned the very ground she stood on. A wave of shame, hot and sharp, washed over her. She slowly retracted her hand from the table, pulling it into her lap as if she had been burned, creating a physical distance that mirrored the vast emotional one that had just opened between them. Leo, with the unerring intuition of a child, sensed the shift instantly. The gentle light in Clara's eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a distant, glassy stare that looked through him rather than at him. He couldn't comprehend the complex adult emotions of wounded pride or social humiliation, but he understood the universal language of withdrawal. He felt the cold front move in. "Are you mad?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze dropping to the half-empty mug in his hands. He thought he had done something wrong, that perhaps mentioning his father's portrait was a mistake. The innocent question was a sharp, painful jab to Clara's conscience. She couldn't possibly explain that her turmoil wasn't with him, but with a cruel twist of fate that had made her feel so profoundly insignificant. "No, Leo, I'm not mad," she replied, but her voice was flat, hollowed out, stripped of all its earlier warmth. All Clara could think about was the staggering injustice of the contrast. Michael Anderson, the brilliant founder whose name was etched in brass, and her, the anonymous nurse, drowning in overdue bills and fighting for overtime just to keep her and her daughter afloat. The partnership agreement, which should have felt like a miracle, instead felt like a final, posthumous act of charity, a secret kept for years that only served to highlight her complete and utter ignorance of the forces that had shaped her life. Her pride, the armor that had protected her through the darkest years of grief and solitude, was now shattered. She had reached out to this boy from a place of pure, unadulterated empathy, and now it felt as though she had been unknowingly participating in a cruel celestial play, auditioning for the role of the pitiable widow. The purity of her gesture was irrevocably tainted. She pushed her chair back from the table, the legs screeching harshly against the linoleum floor in the quiet cafeteria. The sound was abrasive, violent, and it made Leo flinch. "It's late," she announced. Her tone clipped and professional, the efficient nurse reasserting control. "I need to get you back to your ward." The comforting friend who had knelt to his level in the hallway was gone, replaced by this cold, distant authority figure. She gathered the letters and the legal document with stiff, mechanical movements, refusing to meet the boy's confused and wounded gaze. Her only instinct was to flee, to escape the weight of the portrait's stare, to run from the implications of the papers in her hand, and most of all, to get away from the small child who had become an unwitting symbol of her own powerlessness. She felt like an imposter in a story she had no right to be in. The walk back through the sterile corridors was steeped in a heavy, suffocating silence. The few feet that separated them felt like miles. Leo's small hand, which had so readily found hers for comfort earlier, now remained clenched at his side. He kept stealing worried glances up at her face, his dark eyes filled with a silent, pleading question she couldn't bring herself to answer. The fragile, beautiful connection they had forged, a bond built on shared loss and a simple wooden box, had been fractured by the weight of a fortune she never knew existed. As they arrived at the door to the oncology ward, Clara paused, her hand hovering over the handle. A war raged within her, her wounded pride screaming at her to walk away versus the memory of a promise made between two soldiers. Could she see past the shadow of the benefactor to find the boy again? The future of two families hung suspended in that silent, agonizing moment. Standing in the sterile silence of the corridor, Clara's hand remained frozen on the cold, metallic door handle. The image of Leo's small, crestfallen face played over and over in her mind. each replay a fresh wave of shame washing over her. Her pride, a brittle shield she had wielded against the world, had just wounded an innocent child who had lost everything. It was a selfish, ugly reaction born from her own insecurities, her own exhaustion with a life that felt perpetually uphill. She saw her husband's kind eyes, remembered his stories of loyalty and brotherhood, and then pictured the quiet strength in Michael Anderson's portrait. They weren't a CEO and a grunt. They were just David and Michael, two friends who had trusted each other with their lives and their legacies. In that moment, Clara understood that her wounded pride was a pathetic insult to the magnitude of their sacrifice. The promise they made was not a burden to be resented, but a sacred inheritance to be honored. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like both a surrender and a call to action, she pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of a single nightlight, casting long, gentle shadows on the walls. Leo was curled up in his bed, a small, lonely shape under the thin hospital blanket, his back turned to the door. He wasn't crying, but a quiet, defeated stillness emanated from him that was far more heartbreaking. Clara approached the bed, her footsteps soft on the linoleum floor. She knelt down, bringing herself to his level once more, a deliberate act of humility to mend the bridge she had so carelessly burned. "Leo," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, "I am so sorry. I wasn't angry at you. I was just scared. The things in that box were a surprise, and they made me feel small. But that was my feeling, not yours. I was wrong to close my heart to you." Leo turned over slowly, his large, solemn eyes searching hers in the dim light, looking for the truth in her words. Seeing the genuine remorse etched on her face, he gave a small, hesitant nod. Clara reached into her pocket and carefully took out the bundle of letters, laying them on the blanket between them. "This isn't about a big, fancy hospital or a lot of money," she explained softly, her fingers tracing the faded ink of David's handwriting. "This is about a promise. Your dad saved my husband's life, and they promised that if anything ever happened, they would look after each other's families. They wanted to build something amazing together, not for themselves, but for people like us. This partnership, it means we're a team now, you and me and my daughter. We are the promise." She reframed the overwhelming legacy not as a chasm between them, but as the very foundation of their new, shared path. A tiny, fragile smile touched Leo's lips, a flicker of light in the dimly lit room. "A team," he repeated, the word tasting new and hopeful. He reached out a small hand and placed it on top of hers, his fingers resting over the letters that connected their two worlds. The coldness that had filled the space between them finally dissipated, replaced by a profound and resilient warmth. The sterile hospital room no longer felt like a place of sickness and loss, but like a sanctuary where a sacred vow was being renewed. Clara felt a shift deep within her soul. The crushing weight of her struggles as a single mother didn't disappear, but it was no longer hers to carry alone. It was now part of a larger story, a shared purpose that gave her a strength she never knew she possessed. The bond between them had been reforged in the fires of her own humility and was now stronger than ever. As Leo's breathing evened out and he drifted into a peaceful sleep, Clara remained kneeling by his bed, his small hand still resting on hers. She looked from his innocent face to the papers on the blanket, silent testaments to a friendship that had transcended death itself. She finally understood. Michael hadn't just left his son a box, he had left him a guardian. And David hadn't just left her memories, he had left her a mission. The true inheritance wasn't the fortune detailed in a legal document, but the profound human connection that had been waiting patiently for her in the dark. It was the duty to care, the honor of continuing a legacy of friendship, and the unexpected gift of a new family forged from loss. In the quiet of the night, With the gentle hum of the hospital machines as her only witness, she made a silent promise to the two soldiers and to the boy sleeping beside her that this time the promise would be kept. 6 months later, the world was painted in the brilliant, hopeful colors of a new morning. The sterile white of the hospital had been replaced by the warm, buttery yellow of a sun-drenched kitchen, where the sweet scent of pancakes hung in the air. Clara, no longer a ghost haunting the corridors in worn-out scrubs, moved with a newfound lightness, her face free from the deep lines of exhaustion that had once defined her. She sat on a plush rug in the living room, not as a nurse on duty, but simply as a mother. Beside her, her daughter Lily and a visibly healthier, brighter Leo worked together on a large floor puzzle. Their quiet, happy chatter a soothing melody that filled the space. The oppressive weight of survival had lifted, replaced by the simple, profound peace of a life being truly lived, a life where the future was not a threat to be endured, but a promise to be embraced. On the mantelpiece, 2 photographs stood side by side, silent witnesses to their journey. One was the old, faded picture of David and Michael, their youthful smiles now preserved behind clean glass, a testament to a bond that had defied time and tragedy. The other was a new photograph, vibrant with life, showing Clara, Lily, and Leo on a sunny day at the park, their arms around each other in an easy, familiar embrace. Clara had not simply inherited a fortune, she had accepted a mission. Guided by the estate's trustees who had been waiting for years for a sign, she had stepped into her role as co-beneficiary, ensuring that Anderson Medical Technologies was steered not just by profit, but by the compassionate heart of a nurse who understood the true meaning of care. She was now building the future 2 soldiers had once only dreamed of. The journey had taught her a profound and comforting truth about the nature of fate. Sometimes, what feels like an insurmountable delay is merely the universe allowing the right path to find you. Her years of struggle, of feeling lost and left behind, were not a punishment but a preparation. She had to become the person who would stop in a busy hallway, the woman with enough empathy left in her weary heart to see the pain in a small boy's eyes. The promise made between 2 friends had never truly been broken. It was simply a seed planted in the soil of the past, waiting patiently for the right season and the right heart to come along and tend to it. The small wooden box was not an interruption to her life. It was the key that finally allowed her true life to begin. A small tug on her sleeve brought her back to the present. Lily held up a crayon drawing, a masterpiece of childhood innocence. It depicted 4 figures holding hands under a giant, smiling sun. 2 were small children, 1 a woman with bright hair, and the 4th was a man with large, colorful wings, smiling down from the sky. "That's my daddy," Lily announced proudly, pointing to the angel, "and that's Leo's daddy next to him. They're our angels now." Leo looked at the drawing, and a soft, knowing smile touched his lips. In that moment, Clara knew their new family was not built on the ashes of their loss, but on the unshakable foundation of a love that had never truly left them. The memories of David and Michael were not haunting ghosts, but gentle, guiding presences in their home. Clara pulled both children into a deep, encompassing hug, her heart overflowing with a gratitude so immense it felt like a prayer. The morning sun streamed through the window, enveloping the 3 of them in a halo of golden light. A perfect portrait of a family forged not by blood, but by a promise. The greatest legacies, after all, are not etched on brass plaques or written in legal documents, but are carried forward in the simple, daily acts of love and kindness. A promise never truly dies. It just waits for the right heart to find it and give it a new home. If this story of a love that endured and a promise that was finally kept has touched your soul, perhaps you can share it, and in doing so, become part of its unending light.